Hello, all. Welcome to our live stream this month. I'm Natasha Fish, your host and board chair of Be Emboldened. We've got Naomi, who's a regular, and you'll see her a lot, obviously, as being founder and executive director of Be Emboldened, and special guest Michael, which is Naomi's husband. And so it makes sense for us to be talking about couples stuff. So, as a married couple who are celebrating 10 years this year of marriage, we are having them on to talk about the specific challenges related to spiritual abuse in family, marriage, kids, if you're on different pages, etc. So we've got some great questions lined up to get the conversation going. But if you have any questions, this is a live stream and a live Q&A. So please put your questions in the chat. If you're watching a replay, in the comments, we'd love to answer your questions and get you the information you need. Naomi, do you want to start us off with a thought before we dive in?
Yeah, I'm actually first I'm laughing. It's like, yes, I'm a regular guest here at Be Emboldened. It's so good to see you again. Thank you for having me back. But I was thinking when you said 10 years, I'm like, there's probably a lot of people out there because I'm really amazed when I hear people say, oh, I've been married for 30 years. I've been married for 50 years. And I'm like, oh my goodness, you're a legend. And I'm like, people probably hear we're like, oh, you're married for 10 years. And they might be like, okay. When one of the two has been raised in a cult, being married for 10 years is a really big win. And so with some of what we've gone through, 10 years feels like a huge milestone and a really big accomplishment. And so, yeah, that's kind of where this conversation is coming from today. I've had many different couples, whether it's one person in the couple or the two together, reach out and say, this is hard in these different scenarios, whether it's because we both went through a spiritual abuse experience either together or separately that is hard in its own way, or one of the two of us have. And so how do we communicate? How do we come together? What does it look like to respect one another? And so yeah, Michael and I want to share a little bit about, kind of that backstory for us and then what it's looked like for us over the past 10 years, some things that we've learned because we likely haven't done them well and we've learned the hard way, as well as some things that we were attuned to earlier on and that have really served us throughout.
Great. Yeah, that's the why. That's why we're talking about this today. This really is important. I really believe this is a conversation we need to have, and that will help a lot of people. And I hope and I pray that that is true. So I just want to start off by thanking you both for your vulnerability, as Naomi just scratched the surface with how hard this is and the added complications of adding baggage of spiritual abuse and going through that in a marriage. There's a lot of people out there who are struggling with same issues. So thank you guys for being willing to talk about it and help others. Well, I'd love to hear, just catch us up to speed. I mean, 10 years maybe is a drop in the bucket for some couples, but you packed a lot in. But I'd love for us to start on the same page of just understanding the context of how your relationship began, and kind of how those spiritual abuse issues first started to surface. Obviously, go into as much detail as you want to share that you feel is relevant, just to give us a taste of kind of how you guys got together and how spiritual conversations played into that.
Yeah. So, Michael, of course, I'll have you jump in as well. But first, I want to note that we are not in the same room right now, not because we're having an issue. We're not in the same room because there isn't enough space for us both to be in this slice of the computer screen. And I have one microphone. So, anyway, I was like, it feels weird that you're actually not next to me. I kind of went oh, I can reach over and pet you, but you're not actually here. So, anyway, that is not a sign of disunity for anyone who's watching. It's just literal physical issues.
Technical reasons.
Yeah, technical reasons. So when this is the part that I think is relevant to our conversation today, because I want to make sure we get to, the real heartbeat of the question. So here's what I think is relevant. And then Michael, please feel free to add in anything else you think I'm missing. When we met, I was out of the cult in a lot of ways. I had not been living in accordance with the kind of holiness, legalistic practices. I had not yeah, I wasn't in, like, largely in contact with people, I was very much in this healing and rebuilding journey already. That had already started. I was already a couple of years into the really healing and rebuilding. So, that part was already going on, but I was not totally, like, cognitively out. So, I was attending a church, and I would have really incredible experiences at church, as in, like, wow, that is in the Bible. I can go and I can find it and I can see it. That is true. Wow, that's incredible. I had not been told that before. That really starts to change things. And then I'd have this little asterisk, so, like, but they don't know all this stuff. Like, I didn't know what to do with the so-called truths I had been taught, so I didn't know what to do with them. So, they weren't gone out of my life yet. And so that's where I was at when I met Michael. And we started dating, and we got engaged, and we got married, and it wasn't until 4 months married that it clicked for me one day through, like, the most seemingly silly, not a good story moment, which is oftentimes how it happens when you get that final drop of water that overflows the cup, as it's so inconsequential, and yet it changes everything. So it was one of those moments where I knew, "Oh my goodness, that was a cult." And that was the issue, and so then I started the cognitive stuff in a stronger way, and that brought up more emotional stuff in a deeper way, and so that really threw us into the relational stuff that was, me having been raised in a cult. So I think that's what I would say as a backstory that I think is relevant. Michael, anything that you'd add to it?
Yeah, I would add that when we first met and were getting together, you were someone that was going to church and someone who was involved in life groups and someone that was involved in young adults. So you had reached a point in your healing journey where that was a part of your life. It wasn't that I met you outside of church or these events. You were there. So there was some healing that you had to do individually before even stepping foot in a church. So for couples who are listening, I just want to give that caveat as well that when we met, Naomi was in a place where she was able to attend those sorts of activities in her life.
Which is interesting, right? Because it didn't stay that way.
Hmm.
And I wouldn't say I was doing well at that point attending an actual church service. However, here's part of what changed. I'm just kinda reflecting on this right now myself because, yeah, that's a really interesting point that you make. I haven't really thought about that. But I was able to attend church, but I met you, like, a week after I met anybody,
Hmm.
right? And so I was attending church, but I was, like, going into a mega church. I was getting lost. Ooh, what is
That's
that?
me. Sorry.
I was walking into a mega church, totally lost. As it not lost, like, yes, I was lost, but I didn't know I was lost. I was like, "No, I don't want anybody to know me." That was
Hmm.
really lost, like, "Let me go get lost in the crowd and then let me leave." And I had been doing that for months, not going every week, but not because I didn't even want to, because I was so rocked that, like, I couldn't take in any new information for several weeks.
Hmm.
And so finally in February, it was right before Valentine's Day, I was like, "Oh god, I think I'm at a point where, like, I really would like to meet someone, like, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling isolated." It was literally it doesn't always happen instantly, you guys, but in this moment, it was right at the end of that service that a lovely young woman looked at me and said, "This is going the wrong direction." She looked at me and she said, "Hey, are you new here?" I'm like, "Yeah, I am." And so she invited me to hang out with the young adults, like, "Oh, we all go to" it was whether it was, sh Old Old Chicago Grill or whether it was Chipotle that night, whichever one it was, those tended to
Hmm.
be like our rotation, but, and so invited me to go. And so it kind of then grew from there, and I met Michael very soon thereafter. I mean, I heard his voice because he yelled something out in a service that cracked me up that I can still remember, and I found out later that it was him, but I met him like a week after. And so there was a connection with being known at church
Hmm.
and then struggling to continue to go with any sort of regularity. So up until that point, I hadn't tried a life group yet. So then I started trying things like life groups. I started going to things like young adults. But as I became known and there was in my highly triggered, traumatic state, felt there was this expectation then that I be there, I then started to regress, and then I couldn't anymore. So yes, I could, but as soon as I started to know people, I then couldn't. And that's when all that started to come into play.
So that ties into really this first question to kick us off is, what was it like to navigate finding and building community when one of you was triggered in the process? Naomi?
I mean, it was, I think the words that come to mind are like nearly impossible. And that's because building relationships takes consistency. And I was unable to be consistent. And so that was really hard. And I think what can be missed in communication with a partner is that it's not a lack of desire.
Mm.
In fact, it's so not a lack of desire. It may come across like a lack of desire, like, screw that, I am not interested, but it's not, because the desire really isn't deep in our hearts. At least it was the case for me. And I think I could apply that to anyone I've spoken to. It wasn't this lack of desire, it was a lack of ability. And so I was unable because of what happened physiologically in my body when I would try to. And so I literally could not. And I think that was a first communication point that was challenging at the time, because I didn't have words for it myself. I didn't understand what I was going through. And I couldn't find support, hence being emboldened, right? I couldn't find support who understood to even help me find words to then even help me communicate with those whom I loved. And so I really was so poorly equipped to be able to say anything other than I can't do that, or I just won't do that, or it's just not working, or I need it to just stop and I need to make it go away. And so that was really disabling for me. And I think it was really tough in our relationship. And Michael, I'll let you, of course, jump in on what it was like for you, but I wasn't able to give you good language like I could later on. Like, when I'm going to fast forward for a minute, when I think to, when would that have been, like 2018, spring of 2018, where we were down in the Springs and I was really struggling, and I was able to better tell you,
Yeah.
like, this is what's happened. I was at least able
You
to
had
tell
some
you this
weird,
is really, yeah, I could
yeah,
at least tell you this is really serious. Like, this is serious. This is scary. We also like had years under our belt at that, we
right.
were 5 years into our marriage. So we had more of an understanding. And you were able to take that seriously. Like, you really heard me. And you're like, okay, I mean, to the point that it was a factor in you stepping out of your job at the church at the time. So
Mhm.
like, you heard me and you're like, my wife's not messing around. But I remember being so overwhelmed trying to be like, this is big. And it was so helpful, because then we did find a therapist who spoke to what that experience was for me and was able to explain to Michael, this is what's going on. And then it's like, okay, she's not that you were necessarily thinking I was crazy, but it does help to affirm when there's someone from the outside to just help give us that language
Mhm.
of, this is serious and we have to really hear her, because this could actually be dangerous for her mental health. As in, she could end up having multiple personalities disorder, a lot harder to heal from than dissociative disorder. So yeah, just like needing to work some of that through.
Yeah. Well, and at this point, I want to start the conversation with where I was at the very beginning. Okay, not where I'm at now. So let's say it's back to when we were first getting together, first year of marriage, maybe. My thought process at that time was based off of the experience that I had. If you go back into the videos and you want to hear my story, you can. I was on about a year ago. But I had explained in that process, in that podcast, that I really valued church because I came from a very, very unhealthy environment. And the church provided me, a healthy church provided structure, it provided the gospel, it provided love, it provided community. And all of these things were good, right? They were good. So at that time with Naomi, my thought process was, well, you just need to go to the church. You just need to be a part of this life group. You just need to go volunteer. You just need to do more and more of these things. So I'm going back to, again, the very beginning, but this was my mindset of, if you just were able to come to do these things, then the natural result would be what I experienced. You would find community that was great. You would find healing. You would find a way to get through this. But you can't do that outside of this structure. You have to go to this church. You have to go to this group. You have to go to this retreat. And that really is where I was at for a while in our relationship. Looking at, because I didn't have a spiritual abuse understanding, cult understanding or background. The only thing I had ever said over a dinner, Naomi knows this, at Ted's Montana Grill, when she was explaining some of her past, I did say, I think you were in a cult growing up. Because I had some theological, I was not trained in anything. I kind of knew something's off here. I think maybe it was a cult. But my whole demeanor was, you need to go to this group or church or program and dive in wholeheartedly. Just dive in as much as you can.
Yeah, and here's why that doesn't work, right? Anyone who's listening to this or watches this on the replay, the reason that doesn't work is because these things that are supposed to be good, and in many people's stories are good, and even now in my story are good, they had been things that were too similar. Now, for me, they weren't exactly the same, but they were similar. For some of y'all out there, they're going to look exactly the same. If it was a mainstream denominational church, like it could be exactly the same as far as the structure. But for me, it was at least too similar to what had absolutely destroyed me. So it wasn't a good thing. These weren't good things. These were terrifying things that had been used to control, manipulate, extort, hurt, abuse me for, over 2 decades. I mean, heading towards 3 decades at that point. I was 27 when Michael and I met. And yeah, in 28 when we got married. And so all of this stuff that in Michael's mind, of course, because from his experience, they were good things to him. Now, he has since, unfortunately and tragically, experienced some spiritual abuse, which again, he's spoken to. And we're going to have him on as a guest here soon as well to speak about a more recent experience that he had. But at that time, having no framework for it, it was just, this is the really good stuff. And basically, you're not doing what's going to help you. You're avoiding the one thing that's actually going to heal you and help our relationship and all of these really good things. But in reality, they really weren't. And it wasn't my perception because of how they had been used against me. And because of, again, I'm always going to bring in, like, God made us material. We are material beings. And we are also spiritual, but the material side, physiologically, what happens for someone who has experienced, especially complex trauma, we're talking about trauma all through childhood, plus compounding trauma that we experience over the age of 18. We put all that together. We maybe have some complex PTSD stuff going on. I mean, it's just, there can be a lot happening. And even if someone experienced something after the age of 18, we're still having a trauma experience. That's not something that we can just push past. That's not something we can strong arm or strong will ourselves through. And we're not going to be able to put ourselves in environments that are so similar until we get our feet under us. And so until we have some initial healing, until we have some tools. Again, I was totally unequipped in how to help myself in that regard. I had to start learning and figuring this out. And so it really is a process. And I think one of the biggest things we've seen through 10 years is God really is in it. Like when we're wanting to, we are wanting him in our lives, even if we're not totally sure who he is and we're figuring that out, like he is in it. And I can see how he showed up and was just so patient through this journey that you and I were both on together, Michael, and how he was there. Now, at times it felt like he was very absent. There were times where I was like on the floor, laying down, like, God, if you love me, how could this be what you have for me? It was so, I would say it was unbearable, and yet we somehow bore it and continued on. So I guess it wasn't unbearable, but it wasn't unbearable because I knew that I knew that it was temporary. I just had the sense that it's one of the things I shared in my very first 8-minute Storyo video, when Be Emboldened was first getting started as Naomi Wright Ministries. It's temporary. There is hope for change. And I just knew that. And I held on to that. And I knew that you and I were really committed to one another. I had moments of like, I don't know. I've been divorced before, and maybe this will be the second one. I'm not aiming for it. It's not my plan, but good heavens, I did it once. I can do it again, right? So horrible attitude, of course. I don't recommend that to anyone. That was something in me that needed to change. But it was that fight or flight of like, I have to get out. Like I have someone who is loving me and caring for me, supposedly, but he's wanting me to do all these things that are really painful and causing further harm to me. but he didn't understand that that was the case. And so it's just that being able to communicate, and we're hoping that this conversation will help some of you guys figure out the words
Yeah,
for what
and
it is, because none of it was intentional. All of it was love, was from a place of well intention, wanting to love and care for one another, but was missing the mark.
yes, and that's a great way to state that, missing the mark, because now, again, I'm gonna jump back to who I am in now. I'd say, well, why can't you just conform, right? Wouldn't that be, why can't you just conform to what this is already working for all these other people? And so any spouse that is listening right now, or friend or family member, I would highly recommend, if this is all foreign to you and you're like, well, yeah, like the church is good and life groups are good and the Bible is good. And yes, 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 and yes, like I agree with all that, but become educated on spiritual abuse. Because you're then going to understand that, like Diane Laneberg has talked about, the very thing that you're saying is the cure was used as a weapon, and you're asking them to go back to that weapon and to fall on that sword all over again. And it's a very powerful thing to be informed about spiritual abuse and understand it from a place where you're right, like you're missing the mark, and you don't want to miss the mark with your spouse or your family member or friend, and specifically in this conversation, especially your spouse. You want to be able to love your spouse well through this journey. And that is something I would say now, reflecting back on, I didn't do in the beginning. I thought I knew, I'm Christian, I have a Christian community, a Christian church, and I have a way that you ought to be a Christian too. And that was detrimental, in our relationship, and we had to hit a lot of walls that we didn't need to, but that was the perspective I had at that time.
Yeah, I think something else I would kind of follow up with is there were ways that I was still in relationship with God. And some of you may have heard me speak to this, whether it's one on one or in a group mentoring session that we do, or just maybe in a podcast. Maybe I've mentioned it, but I had this Papasan chair. It's like, for any of you that don't know, it's like those big round wicker with like the big round cushion that's really soft. I had like the Sherpa, really fuzzy one.
It
And
holds
so
you.
that was what?
This kind of holds you.
Yeah, and I'm like, if I would imagine it feels like you're in the womb when you like get in it and you're like curled up and you're like cradle up in it. And I would sit there and I would try to read my Bible, but that was hard for me at that time. And so, and hard as in, I'm saying that for those who would understand me, but for any partners out there who maybe don't understand directly through their own experience, it was hard for me because the Bible had also been used against me. And so I just didn't fully know. I wasn't confident in how to read it yet. I didn't have a study Bible that was guiding me. I didn't even know what that was. I very well may have still had a more difficult version to read. That was just harder and created more work and got in the way. Definitely hearing my dad's teachings when I read and just not knowing how to exegete properly. I didn't know how to do it. And so it was really difficult. And so I would be triggered by that. And then I would just shut down, and it was like I couldn't even see the words on the page to even read. And so I would try, and I remember I would like set my Bible down and be like, this just isn't working. And so one thing I would do is I would write out prayers to God, and that was really helpful. So I'd actually write like, Dear God. It makes me think of that Judy Blume, which came out as a movie recently. Dear God, it's me, Margaret. So yeah, Dear God, it's me, Naomi, and here I am again with the same problem. Can you please help me? So I would do that, and I would also just have quiet time. I would literally lay there, close my eyes, and be like, Lord, I don't have words. I have been told that the Holy Spirit, you cry out on our behalf. Will you please do that? I don't have words. Like, will you just hold me? And I would just rest with him for a period of time. I also loved going on hikes and going on walks and things like that with God. That was really good. And I was aware of his presence. Like, it was intentional time of, God, I believe that you're real. I have felt that you love me. It's not just that I've heard it. I have felt your love for me. And so can you just be with me? Can we just spend time together? And those were things that for me were really good in my relationship with the Lord at the time. So different, though, than the structure, of course, that Michael, you spoke to that had been really good for you. And so it was hard to understand one another in that time frame, that what I was doing was just as good. And that didn't mean that I should be isolated forever. Community is so important, having other people that we can have relationships with. I mean, that's not really the point of our conversation today. Go look up our conversation with Mary Jo Sharp. Maybe we can link it below after. That's a great one to listen to if you want more information on that, because you'd be like, heck no, it's not good for me. It may not be for now. It was a goal I had for later. I wanted to get to the point where I could do that. And that was also something, gosh, we could segue in so many directions, but it was hard for me not to be where Michael was at, because I saw Michael as a person that wasn't deeply wounded in this regard. He had woundings of other kinds, but I'm like, he didn't have this wounding. I'm like, I can't be like him. And it was like it was shining this spotlight on my brokenness. And it made me feel so much, even more inadequate and incapable. And it was so discouraging, because I'm like, I can't be you right now. And it was just really discouraging. And yet at the same time, I was really concerned about him getting his needs met. And so I'll press pause there, but I definitely want to make sure we come back to that, because for those of us who have experienced the abuse, we still really want our partners who did not experience the abuse, we want them to still get what they need. And so that was another difficulty that we had, was I wanted to make sure Michael got what he needed. And so as much as he was pushing on me, I started pushing back on, but you do what you need to do. So you need to go to church, and you need to do this, and you need to do that, because that's what you need. You thrive there. And it was from a well-intentioned place, but I was missing some of the struggles that caused for him. And again, I'll press pause there. We can come back to it.
I think this leads into our next question really well, which is, you described how you were, attempting and succeeding at various levels of connecting with God. And it looked very different, but how did you connect spiritually with each other? For example, praying or reading scripture together. Was that even possible?
No, and that's the honest answer. It's not a pretty one. It is not the one that anyone wants to hear you say, but that is the true answer. Yeah, babe, I remember, and it's been interesting, because now that I'm in a different place, we have to go back and both relearn habits that he actually already had, that were then lost because I shut them down. And so neither of us has them. And so we're having to start over again. Babe, I don't know if you would agree with that, or if you've thought about that. Like, we have a desire now to pray together. Neither of us is in a great habit of doing that. Like, we're having to be really intentional about it. But when we first got married, Michael wanted to pray together every day. Like, he was wanting to lead in that and wanting to encourage that. And I'm like, I cannot. He was wanting to read the Bible together. I could not. And so all of these really good things, classically good things, truly, genuinely good things that he wanted to do, I couldn't. And so I would shut them down. And I mean, like, I would shut them down. This wasn't like, you're nodding because you know about it. So this wasn't like, oh, babe, yeah, maybe not today. This was like, get away from me. You are now the enemy, because I am so triggered. I am through the roof. Like, I am floating in the sky looking down at the situation right now. And absolutely not. I cannot do it. And so he was getting like hardcore shut down by me. I was calm. I'd try to explain it, but again, we didn't have the language for it. So that was hard. So yeah, go ahead, jump in, please.
Yeah, we didn't have the language for it. But what I want to jump in and say is, you couldn't do those things, but we could do some things. And that's something that I'm grateful for in our relationship. So no, we couldn't sit down and like do a Bible study together, but we have gone to conferences together, or we went to church and sat in the back together, or we went to a conference. I already say that, conference, or watched a movie. A movie would be good. Sometimes like it would be now get us thinking and talking. We would still go to friends' houses that were Christian, and we would do activities that were wholesome. So it wasn't like, okay, I can't progress in any way we can't progress anyway as a couple. We can't move forward anyways. Of course we could. I think the key thing I want to highlight for anyone listening is there's other ways to do it that, for me, I'm speaking to myself here, to be more open-handed. So yeah, we did struggle. I did struggle saying, well, why can't you do these things? But reflecting back on it, it's like, well, we did do things though to start the journey moving forward. And we have a 10-year story of moving forward. And so now at 10 years in, we can say we want to read the Bible together. We want to prioritize praying together. But there is other steps that we took, I would say, that brought us to that point that we're at. Because if you're at a place in your relationship and it's really, really tense, and you can say, well, we can't do these things. That's, in my view, just what can you do, together to keep moving forward as a couple? What is safe right now?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And it's making me think of other things. So, no, we weren't praying together as a couple. We weren't sitting down and having Bible reading time as a couple. Yeah, we did attend conferences together. The church attendance was just irregular.
Mhm.
We did have a couple different life groups that we were a part of at different times, again, irregular. One was actually, they were both fairly regular for a while. They were just hard for me,
Mhm.
and they weren't like super long lasting, but I think both of them actually sort of kind of fell apart anyway. Like they didn't, keep going for years or something
Mhm.
beyond when we
Right.
stopped.
There was
So I think
there
they
was
were
a
like,
point. Mhm.
yeah, I think they were kind of shorter term anyway. And I did have some benefit from them. So if anyone out there is like, well, yeah, I could, but like, I don't know. If you're able to give it a try, again, I did get things out of it. It was the regularity and that expectation and that feeling of commitment that I just could not do. And so something I learned I needed was anything I was going to be a part of, I would have that as the expectation of I'm working through some things. I am healing through some things. I'm processing through some things because maybe I didn't want to get into the detail. And oftentimes I did not actually continue to hide a lot of what my past had been. Um, and that would be kind of a separate discussion as to if I would recommend that or not. I think it's going to depend on who you're engaging with and how much you should share. But for me, it was more keeping it close to my chest because I just had always been trained to do that. So it was just automatic to filter everything out because I was raised to keep everything a secret. So I just sort of kept doing it, minus, some very few people and maybe minor details, or like, just a little bit of information. But I would get something out of it, but I would let people know I may or may not be here. And if this is a solid commitment of like, you are expected to be here every Sunday at blah, blah, then I just couldn't make the commitment. I just had to bow out of it, which was a bummer, but that's what I needed to do. So I needed to make sure that the expectation was clear and people were okay with that. But yeah, we also worship music was great for me. I actually had not grown up. I grew up listening to hymns and then musicals. And, so as far as like worship music, it was hymns. And I have such an appreciation for beauty and I still found hymns beautiful. So that was never actually tainted for me. Music in my household was always actually a reprieve. It was a goodness. And so we could play music together. Now, granted, our music was not the same. But that's a different issue.
Worship, but
So
we would sing worship in the car together. We did go to a couple concerts together.
mhm.
So yeah, there was things that we still found the connection in our spirituality together in. And something I want to add to this conversation is reflecting back on this now. The key thing is defining those safe activities with your spouse and that being okay. So I think it's an appropriate moment to share a story about an experience, Naomi, that you had with a retreat that which would
Yeah.
highlight this, where Naomi decided to go to a women's retreat, and there was, of course, all this structure and all these activities. And then Naomi decided, I'm going to step away from one of these activities and go on a hike with God. Well, when she returned, that was seen as a moment that she missed out on with God. And reflecting back on this as a husband and knowing what I know now, it's like the response that I should have as a husband is that's wonderful that you were able to go have a hike with God. And maybe I didn't need a hike with God at that moment. I wanted this lesson or this teaching or this community group activity, but all of that's okay. Um, and that's what I would want to share with a spouse right now who's navigating this. Maybe you're newly married or you're just now dating. So if you're not married, but you're just now dating, or you're maybe a couple years into marriage and you're just really struggling, find those activities that are safe and then encourage your spouse in those safe things. Um, and that's good. That's good. It doesn't have to look like you or like your friends or your church community or whatever. It can look specific to that individual. Now, Naomi already said, don't be alone for forever. Like, there's some wisdom in coming back and connecting with your spouse and with friends and community, but it can look differently is what I would say. And that's something I would want to share now, 10 years in, that I've learned.
Yeah, I think what I'd want to emphasize there is there's value in the practices that we can't do. There still is value in them when we're able to. Once we're able to do them, great, let's do them. But when we're unable to do them, let's let that be okay. And like Michael said, let's figure out where we can overlap and then let's embrace those. Let's make sure that we're intentional about making room for them in our lives.
Having those expectations aligned, I think, are so critical. And that can be what is such a big challenge, is when you expect someone to behave or engage spiritually in a certain way and that person's your spouse and they're not. That can be really scary and feel threatening, and feel like maybe I married the wrong person and maybe this person doesn't have as strong of a spiritual walk as I thought. And, we're supposed to be equally yoked, which, by the way, that verse is definitely taken out of context. But just this idea of like, maybe this person's spirituality isn't what I thought it was, and that it was maybe a mistake to be married to that person. That is not the case, is what I think we're trying to say here, is that there's room for there being different levels of spiritual engagement, but that can be really challenging when you don't even have the words for it. So I know you didn't then, you do now, which, praise God, and you made it past that. I'm sure there are lots of couples who haven't. But while you didn't have that, and while you were figuring this out, how did you guys receive support from others while maintaining confidentiality and respecting each other's privacy? Because there was a lot going on that was really tough for both of you to navigate. And what did support look like for you?
Yeah, Michael, I think that ties into what we were talking about, what I mentioned a little bit earlier that I wanted to circle back to about me wanting you to have support and how that presented challenges for you that I didn't realize at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, I guess, if you realized it at the time. I don't have a memory of you directly saying to me, like, this is the issue. So I don't know if maybe you didn't want to share because you're like, well, I don't want to put that on her, or if you didn't really have language for it at the time yourself either. But I know that I was really wanting you, especially once we had our son. And we had that period of time where it was like the real pressure cooker, where I was going to go one direction or the other with mental health. And fortunately, I found good support and went in a good direction, and I'm where I am now. But when we had our son, and I'm like, I really have to step out of church attendance right now because it was so bad. And I've told this story before, and it was definitely because my husband was on staff. And when the husband's on staff, and no, I do not agree with this, and yet it does happen. So again, so many other issues that we could delve into today. But oftentimes there's expectations on the spouse. And now this was a healthy church. So it wasn't like, oh my gosh, Naomi has to do everything, has to be at everything. But it was weird if I wasn't at anything. And Michael, I know you can get into that more. And so I was just really like, it all came to a head. Like, this had been boiling under the surface and it kind of popped its head out here and there, and it like exploded. And I was dissociative for days at a time. And I'm talking like imagining ripping my skin off and running down the street to get out of my body. It was really extreme. And I felt like there was a rubber band in my brain that was about to snap. And I remember going to Michael, I remember us being in the kitchen. I remember coming up to you and saying, I feel like I literally felt like there was something in my brain that was so taut, it was going to snap. And I told him this, and I said, I just know, whether it's from some education I've had and I'm just not able to remember exactly what I was told, like, but I can feel it. If it snaps, I'm not going to be the same anymore. And I don't know if I'm ever going to come back. And I remember telling you that. And I had nothing to base it on that I could remember other than this is what it feels like. And then when we found help, the therapist told me, Naomi, that is what happens that throws someone into having multiple personalities disorder. And it is really, really hard. It's not impossible, but it's a lot harder to work that through and bring yourself back into wholeness, mentally, emotionally, and so that's what I was feeling. So I was not wrong. It was a serious moment. It was a danger moment. And so I going through all of that was like, I don't want our son though not to go to church because he gets to go and play with the kiddos and he likes it and it's good and I want him to be around it and I want you to go to church because you've gone all this time without getting what you need and you thrive in that environment and your relationship with God matters. So I still need you to lean into your relationship the way you need it to look, because inevitably also if you didn't, that was going to impact your family too. So part of it was just total sacrificial because I would have loved to have just had you with me on Sunday mornings. Again, you going without me highlights that I'm not there. But part of it was also selfish of, I want you to be getting what you need because that's gonna help our family as a whole, as a unit. And so that was really tough too. So what again, and I would love if you would share directly what decision you made and how you would reflect on that now and maybe why you made that decision.
Yeah, and with everything you just said, researching spiritual abuse and knowing what's going on in the body, um, just all of this is so real. Like spiritual abuse is real, and so someone who's listening, like these things can happen to someone who suffered through significant spiritual abuse or had a spiritual abuse background. For me, when I was going into those environments at the time, I felt like I couldn't look the part, be the part, right? Like I couldn't really be a good Christian husband if my wife isn't present, right? How am I on staff if she's not volunteering? Again, these things aren't true to what a healthy Christian community should be. And I'm not even saying they put that on me. This was something internal. But from our beginning of our marriage to now, it's changed a lot. But through that process, there was this lie that we had to have this great Christian, quote unquote, Christian relationship if we were going to be involved in a church, if we were going to have community. And so if I'm walking in, one of the first things that's going to be asked of me is, well, where's your spouse? Right. And I didn't really know how to answer that at the time. And so what I would do instead of facing that and bringing community in, respectfully, of course, like figuring out what was appropriate to share and not share with, going in, knowing that information first. But I thought it would be better to try to do this privately. And then when we're good and we're good to go, we'll then enter community. We'll enter the church. And if we know anything about God, God doesn't ask us to get perfect and then come to Him. We're broken and we go to Him. And then same thing with community. Like we don't need to put on a facade. So now I have a totally different perspective. But then at that time, it was really hard to show up on Sundays or life groups or Bible studies and say, yeah, I'm here, but the person that I'm married to is not. So reflecting back on that, I would say that really actually probably hindered, not even probably did, hindered our relationship from growing. The one thing I would share that I'm still so thankful for that I continue to do is I always said, I know Christ is the answer. Jesus is the answer. So I'm going to continue to pursue God and Christ and remain in relationship with Him through this. But looking back on this, I did make it harder on myself by not engaging, at least individually, in community, in these different things that I had been doing prior to marriage. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'm just going to wait until we're good or we are both at the same place in our journey with God, I would caution you to reconsider that approach, because you may, like myself, look back and say, gosh, I made it so much harder than I had to.
Mhm. And I would add, if you're me in this situation, some version of me, the person who has experienced the spiritual abuse, which may include other forms of abuses very easily as well. My story certainly does include other forms of abuses under, within that spiritual abuse context. How I had mentioned earlier, it's kind of shines a light on my brokenness for you to also go. It's like, well, I'm home alone while my husband is at church. And that's hard. And so it could make me somewhat be like, well, I just want him to stay here and be with me. Like it'll somehow make it more okay that I'm unable to go. Let that die and encourage your spouse to go, because your spouse needs to get their relational needs met. Your spouse needs to get their spiritual needs met. And if they are going to thrive in this sense of community and this corporate worship time with the Lord, or whatever that's going to look like, as long as it's, we're talking about these ethical practices and things like that. If he wants to go join an all women's life group, we've got a different conversation. But yeah, if he's doing something that he is needing and it is good, encourage him to do it. It doesn't mean you can't share, oh, this is hard for me, but I want you to go. Like that vulnerability, you guys can support one another then. So please don't feel like you got to bottle it up and pretend that you're just like, yay, cheerleader. And if it's like, gosh, this is tough for me today, it's okay to share that, but with encouragement of, but you've got to go do it. And I'm so proud of you for doing it, because it's serving our family for you to also get your spiritual needs met. And this is what it just needs to look like for me right now. And hopefully it's encouragement for us to keep looking forward towards the hope that we have, that we're not going to be where we're at forever, that it is temporary. We will continue to journey forward. So yeah, I would say let that die and encourage your spouse to get what they need.
That's so good. I know we've been asking the questions of Michael and Naomi today, and I just want to ask a couple questions of anyone who's watching here. If you appreciate learning from others but have had trouble finding a safe environment you can trust, if you're looking for qualified support, just like Michael and Naomi shared about, but don't really need or want one-on-one services, or do you want to keep costs down? Because budgets do matter. If you answered yes to any of those questions, we'd love for you to consider our group mentoring, especially if you're a couple struggling through these kinds of situations. At about a quarter of the cost per person, we can provide that much needed support to if you're searching for it, and in a new way that connects many points like solidarity and empathy, an opportunity to connect with each other as a couple, and also others, with people who just get it and know what you're going through. So if you think mentoring group might be right for you, we do have those launching this fall, and we'd love for you to register by August 31st if that's something that it might be of interest to you. We have one more question for Michael and Naomi before we close out today. And they've done a beautiful job of answering, I think, throughout this discussion of how they've supported one another. But you've mentioned you guys have a son. How did and how would adding a child or more children to this dynamic make an impact and on those struggles in this area? How has that changed how you guys navigate this?
Oh, that chokes me up a little bit. So when I was going through that really, really tough period that I just mentioned, when we were down in the Springs, where I felt that rubber band situation, and I found a therapist who, of course, didn't know my context, as none did. But incredible, incredible guy. So thankful for him. He saw us through some really tough things in our relationship. And he was able to see what was going on. He didn't get distracted by the context, which was such a gift to me. And I remember him saying to me, like, Naomi, this is going to be a really hard thing that you're going to take on if you choose to take it on. And you're successful, you present great, like you've built a life for you that honestly doesn't make sense. Basically, that you've been able to do this, and praise God, by his mercy I have. He's like, are you sure you want to take it on? And I knew that if I continued to disconnect, I would be emotionally disconnected from my son. And that was just not a life I was willing to accept for myself or for him. And so I took it on because of him. And it was really hard. And it was so worth it. to be able to emotionally connect with my baby. And so I share this story to say that no, children don't fix anything. My child inspired me and gave me more motivation to persevere and continue on in my journey. Now, I did not have him for that reason. I happened to have him, and that is how he intersected with my life. And I'm so thankful to him for that. And the grace that kids have, good Lord, for their parents. So I think I also want to mention, because I don't know that we really directly answered what external supports looked like for us. External supports were hard to come by. As Michael was sharing, it was, to what degree are we comfortable giving information? And I think something, because my story was my story. And I hold it that way whenever someone shares something with me. I had a lovely person yesterday sharing some very, personal and vulnerable things with me. And like, that's still their story. That's not my story to tell just because they shared it with me. They entrusted it with me. They didn't give it to me. So it's not now mine. And so Michael knew so much of my story, but it wasn't his story to then go tell everybody else. And yet we're married and he has to answer some basic questions that are very normal and understandable to get asked. So it was important for him and I would offer this to all of you, to have a conversation about what can we say? What's okay? I know I've got to give you something you can say. I know I've got to do that. I can't just be like, man, just say nothing. Say she's sick again. I mean, you start to feel like, this is absurd. Like, now they're going to start delivering meals because they're really getting, hey, I'll take those. But, it's like, this gets awkward. Yeah. So I want to offer you something. This is a partnership. I care about you. I want to make this easier on you if I'm able to do so, and vice versa. What am I okay with him sharing? And then let's be respectful of that. And if we get more pushback, come back to me and say, hey, they actually had these questions I didn't really know how to answer. Okay, what else are we comfortable sharing? And there's some people that we'll share on a deeper level with because they're trusted. We've built that relationship. I always say trust is arrived at. And so we arrive there and now we're going to share more because that trust has been built. And we actually have a communication scale that I love teaching. I actually think I taught it twice today already. And it's this 1 through 5 scale. If it's something that intrigues you, reach out to us. We could even just schedule 1 or 2 sessions just to teach this to you. But it's really helpful, and it helps us gauge basically how low to how high risk of information we're going to share, how not vulnerable to how vulnerable, and we can think about where we're going to land in that conversation. And sometimes it's person specific, sometimes it's incident specific, sometimes it's environment specific. So it's a really helpful tool to start to think through at what depth, because I might say I only want to share at this like pretty superficial level, and Michael might be like, I really need support though. In order to get support, I'm gonna have to share at a really deep level. We got to figure that out, because we're gonna step on each other's toes, and it's gonna be way worse actually than stepping on each other's toes if we're talking about people's safety and security and what their story has been. And in that being shared, that could be really unethical to do to one another. It's going to break our trust as a couple. We want to build our trust as a couple through this journey. So I want to mention that, like, just talk to one another, figure out what can we say, and keep reevaluating. Is that working? Is it not working? Is someone still really not like, oh, this is real tough? Because we wouldn't want that to be a barrier to getting support if we're able. And in any relationships in that we have, where are we comfortable going? And again, reminding ourselves that, yeah, we're going to arrive at that trust. Our environment may not have taught us that. Our environment may have taught us that you just trust, you tell everybody everything. If that was you, that's not healthy. It's not safe. It's not really how it works.
Well,
So just some things. Yeah, go ahead, babe.
Well, I love that you're going here at the end, because especially with Natasha, you asking about children, you're going to know pretty much right away if you give the answer and that person is negative or has a negative response, then that's going to give you an indicator. Well, maybe this isn't the person to share more information with. Maybe this isn't a healthy environment. What I would definitely recommend is that as you get on the same page with your spouse about what you are going to say when you arrive at a faith community or a church, what is their response back to you? Because when you bring kids into the mix, you want to find trusted, safe people for them to have relationships with as well. And to understand that someone is on a journey with God and in a process that might look different than yours, and want to be supportive and loving and helpful and open is going to let you move forward knowing, okay, this might be a safe community for me to continue to bring my family to down the road, or bring my son or daughter into now. So the where you went with that, I think, is so key, especially with children, because that initial response or reaction is going to let you know, can I move forward?
Oh, well, thank you guys both for sharing so many good stories, so many practical examples, so much good information, and really from the heart too, and your vulnerability. Um, you guys have lived this, and there are people living it right now who don't have the answers and need help. And so we do hope and pray that this is useful and encouraging and helpful for people out there listening. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have more questions or need additional support. We'd love to serve you in that way. We're going to wrap up today. Naomi, Michael, thank you again for being here. If there's any other final thoughts you have to add, please share.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much, Natasha. When we think about having others and other people who are safe, who are trusted, it can feel so discouraging because it's risky, right? And for those of us who have experienced abuses of our trust, it is so risky. It feels so risky. And so that is really, this isn't really intended to be a plug. It's just an offer for anyone who it would be helpful with. And Natasha, I know you already spoke to it, but this is really the heartbeat of why we are launching mentoring groups, is because when we're wanting to connect with others in some way, but we're fearful of it, it's scary to do, it's risky to do, we've just seen it as a gap. Like, we've identified it as a gap. And so we want to offer that to hopefully fill the gap, at least for a period of time, until you're in a position to go seek local community. And so the mentoring groups are virtual. They are capped so that they don't get too big, but we're happy to open more as they become filled. They don't have a set curriculum or something that we're going through. They're designed for conversations like this, like, let's come together and what's going on. What has the past week been? What are you bringing in with you today? And everyone can learn from that. People can chime in. People are going to resonate. People are going to understand. And we have an ethical agreement that we all agree to that includes confidentiality with anyone who's present. It includes how we speak to one another, just ensuring people are respectful, they're understanding. And so I think we have 6 points that we ask everyone to agree to, and we remind everyone of that at the beginning of every session. And so we facilitate and we moderate and we share. We offer things that are equipping, things that we've learned, whether it's through lived experience, like Michael and I are speaking to, training, like by the degrees that I hold in being a licensed mental health professional, my degree from seminary, like we bring those things in, and our continued professional experience, like, hey, this is what we see. This is what's going on. We have met with people across the country, not just across the country, across the world. And so we've heard all these different stories. Here's sort of our themes. Here's what's going on. And so being able to offer this place where you can hopefully see it as, okay, this is a trusted environment where I get to dip my toe into whatever this community thing is. And I get to step into that and I get to be where I'm at. And that's okay. And I have these rules in place and I have some structure to it, but I also get to just show up with whatever's going on right now with other people who understand because they've lived it. There's overlap in our stories. So that is the heartbeat behind why we opened up these groups, why we're getting them off the ground, is to offer that for anyone who's looking for it. Because what we have experienced firsthand is it's really tough to find.
My last comment would be, you both have permission to move towards God at your own pace and speed.
Yeah, and just trust that he's going to get us there. I tell people that all the time when they're in a couple. It's like, just trust. If they love the Lord, they want to know who he is, they want to find him, they're going to find him. It's okay if it takes longer. His time frame is different. It's okay. They're going to get where they need to get to. You can exhale.
So,
It's okay.
yeah. He's there.
Yeah.
So good. Thank you all for sharing so vulnerably and transparently. We really appreciate everyone who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next live stream.
Thank you.